Hi everyone, I'm Christina, and this is my January wrap-up. So this month I read a total of 10 books. The first book I read this month was All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I read this at the very end of December. And I was very happy that this was going to be my first book of 2015, and it definitely was a really, really good book. It's probably one of the best historical fiction books I've read in a while, and I definitely suggest it if you love World War II historical fiction and you haven't read it yet. This book I read was a book that probably had no clue I was going to read until the day I read it. But I saw Jamie from Ermengarde Books talk about the Book of Ivy by Amy Engel so much, and just when she told us the premise, I had to see what this was about. That book, it was so good. The concept totally was amazing. And basically I just want the sequel in my life now because I was left on a sort of a cliffhanger. So the author did what she intended to do, wrote a really good book, wrote some good characters, wrote a really interesting romance. Next up, I read my first book pick out of my 2013 added TBR jar. My TBR jar for this year is a smaller one, and it's the books I added to Goodreads in 2013 when I got my Goodreads, because I don't have a lot of them and I'd like to clear that list completely so I feel less like, oh, I have books on there but I'm meaning to read since 2013, but really they've been longer because that's just when I got Goodreads. So the first book that I've kind of been dying to read forever is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. As an avid historical, World War II historical fiction reader, this is still my favorite ever. It will probably constantly be my favorite World War II book I like. But basically, I absolutely, utterly adore historical fiction World War II books. I will say that I liked All the Light We Cannot See better. And things I liked about The Book Thief, I also didn't like. It was kind of weird for me in that way. It was still an amazing book and stuff, and I wanted to keep reading it. It had that element to it. Next up, I read my first new release of the year, and it was Never Never by Colleen Hoover and Tarryn Fisher. This was amazing. This is why I love having Colleen Hoover in my life. Tarryn Fisher, who I haven't read, I know was a much more darker writer, which made this book much more darker in tone, but it was just so gripping and enticing, and the way it ends, just read it just so you can figure out how it ends, and it's very short. It's so short, but it's such a great thrill ride, and I really appreciated it for that. Next up, I read another book I've been dying to read forever, and it was Aristotle and Dante, Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alire. So this one has always been a contemporary that everyone talks about, that everyone loves, that I kind of wanted to eventually get to, and I'd always be like, oh, I'll read it this month, and I finally was like, okay, it's a little book club pick, I'll read the dang book. I finally read it, and I understand what the hype is about it, and I understand why people love it, and it was really good, and I think more people should read this book, just based off of, I think it'd be good for the betterment of society if more people read this book. Definitely out of my comfort zone of YA contemporary, but sometimes it's good to read a YA contemporary that brings you out of that comfort zone. It takes you away from the fluffy side of it or the teenage drama side of it and takes you into something that's super realistic and super relevant to our world. So next, I read The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. Back when this was announced, I lost it. I was so happy. Tithe by Holly Black, which I have here signed. This is my favorite portrayal of fairies. This in Cassandra Clare's way, because they're basically the same way, with the seelie, unseelie court, all that stuff. So I really trust Holly Black in terms of writing fae. I was worried The Darkest Part of the Forest was just going to be too much like the modern fairy tales, but it had its own sense to it. It was more human-based, and it had a much better romance and much nicer characters. Alright, now we have to talk about basically a film that's been dominating my entire life right now. The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Basically everyone loves this series, and I finally read the first book, and I understand the hype. And if you are like, oh, I don't want to read it because it's hyped, go. Like, you won't hate it because you'll have a high expectation and you won't reach it. It pushed away the hype cloud, and it was just awesome. And I was worried I was going to drown in how thick it was, and that I was going to be confused because I've never read a high fantasy adult novel. But it was so good. The characters are so awesome. The magic system is so awesome. The pacing, the setting, it's a bit slow at the beginning, but you push through that like right away. And you look and you're like, I read that in a week. It's so thick. I'm like, I ended up getting another school book this month, and it was Emma by Jane Austen. This summer, I had read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, because everybody who loves Jane Austen loves Pride and Prejudice, and this is known as her best work. I actually enjoyed Emma more than I enjoyed this, and I think one of the main reasons is I like Emma approved more than I like the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Next up was my most anticipated release of the month, Fairest by Marissa Meyer. This was the prequel to the Lunar Chronicles, and it is the story of the antagonist of the series. So if you haven't read the series, you should not be reading this book. Even though it is a prequel, it is still supposed to be read in between the third book and the not yet released fourth book. So, straighten that out in case you want to go up and hop on the series, which you should, because it's awesome. And Prince Kai, I had to mention him at one point. Queen Lavanna is the villain I love to hate most. Last book I read this month was another release I was anticipating that I didn't even think I love as much as I do. I Was Here by Gail Forman. It was so good, and I could see someone being like, I don't want to read it because it's about a girl whose best friend commits suicide, but it's so much more than that. It becomes kind of a mystery and a romance. And I know I've read reviews where people have been like, the romance was gross and the romance was unnecessary, but I actually liked the element to the story like it gave, and just the way she tied other things into it, and just the realisticness of everything going on. Gail Forman's done her research on this book. If you're worried it's going to be some fake portrayal of suicide, it isn't. Gail Forman interviewed a lot of people who were affected by suicide, either by a family member or by a friend, and this story is based off a certain story that was told to her in that experience. And quickly we'd like to touch on the fact that this could have been 11 books if I had gotten my stuff together and had finished The Well of Ascension today. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.